for the battered but proud people of the Empire State. From the financial and entertainment epicenter of New York City to the sleeping and empty small cities and towns of upstate, which once bustled with manufacturing, mining, and farming. We all know from inspiration, history, and nature, we deserve a return to the success and growth of generations past, a birthright being squandered by corruption in Albany, and the depredations of an insecure, scheming mountebank posing as governor, who loathes both us and himself. As liberty beckoned to enslaved peoples behind the Iron Curtain via American broadcasts after World War II, we now say, believe, rise, and join us. Welcome to Radio Free New York.
Hey guys, welcome to Radio Free New York. I'm your host, Andrew Hollister, and today is Talk of the Town. So we have not only Bob here with us, but we've got Kevin as well.
Hello.
All right. So I tell you what, yesterday we did I had to skip out on the radio show, so we did a rerun, and I feel like it's been like a week since I've done a show. I feel all out of practice, just missing one day. But today I think we've got a really good topic that Kevin brought in. This will apply to communities all across New York State at one point or another, especially like some of the cities are now trying to push this forward as well. We'll talk about what it is. We're going to talk about rent control today and rent stabilization, and specifically, we're going to cover everything. But what I want to cover specifically today is why Democrats should oppose rent control. Because I think that typically speaking, when people hear of rent control or rent stabilization, they assume that it's like a Democrat thing, a left-wing thing, and they're not necessarily wrong either.
It's mostly coming from the left, and they think that they're helping. They think that, we will stabilize rents and stop gentrification, and then everyone will be able to afford their houses again.
Yeah, and I think that there's this perception, and perception comes from, the things that we see, that like people believe that people on the right and Republicans, they support small businesses, and therefore they would want to protect people against rent control. And on the other side, people say, well, Democrats, they want to protect poor people, so they're for rent control at the expense of basically anybody else. That's kind of how it's projected.
Yeah, that's the perception. But the reality is that rent control just hurts everyone.
Yeah, essentially. That's
actually there's a great quote that I want to read from an economist named Oscar Lindbeck, and he said that short of bombing, I know of no way to destroy a city that was more effective than rent control.
Yeah, I saw that. I thought that was awesome. But we're going to talk about why that is. So if you're listening to the show, this is going to be great for you, regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum. There's going to be a little bit of everything for you. And if you oppose rent control, you should listen, because you're going to have like a solid argument against.
So you're going to make everybody mad today.
I hope so. That's no. I think people are going to
every time I come on this show.
No, I think realistically speaking, people are going to leave the show hearing some stuff they just haven't heard discussed about rent control. And as usual, I always try to give some good educational background before we jump into the discussion. So the first thing we're going to talk about is just the history of rent control and rent stabilization. It's been around for a long time, or at least the concept has, starting back in World War I, which I guess I was just kind of naive going into the topic, not realizing that this has been around for so long. But it came about in World War I. And then in 1919 to 1924, a bunch of cities and states, they started to adopt rent and eviction control laws. And it's interesting that it's specified as eviction control laws, especially that early on, because that really speaks to there's probably three sides to this. There are the landlords, the tenants, and then the community that suffers the economic impact as a result of it, which are not always landlords or tenants. They could just be people who own property, and because of these rent control laws, it also controls property values, which then can control your ability to buy or sell your home.
Or future renters, too. It's not... that's kind of a separate route. Yeah. People who are renting currently as the law gets enacted, and then people who are going to be renting 5, 10, 15 years later after the law is done done its damage.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting that one of the things mentioned is eviction control laws, because I feel like that's one of the things that people lead with as like, we are protecting people. We're defending them from becoming homeless. We're going to address those issues. But I just wanted to like highlight that. I always look at language and how language is used, because I think that messaging is like really important and we should be paying attention to it. So then the modern rent controls that we're looking at were first adopted in response to World War II era shortages, and some of that being, people just being deployed elsewhere in the world, not being there, and people saying, well, we're going to protect these families from rent changing and this whole thing. And then after that, Richard Nixon's 1971 wage and price controls was kind of like the next iteration that's built rent control to see to what it is today, essentially. So what's it look like today, based on all those things that have happened? And as of 2019, so this I don't think has changed in the last 2 months. California, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, and Oregon and the District of Columbia all have some form of rent control enacted. There are 37 states that either prohibit or preempt rent control, and 8 states allow their cities to enact rent control, but have no cities that have implemented it.
Right. And in New York State specifically, the New York State Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019 was passed last year. New York City's had rent control for quite a while now, but upstate cities didn't really have that option, or at least didn't have like kind of state permission to do that until last year when they implemented this law. And
Yeah, no, absolutely. So being that we are here in New York, of course, we're going to talk about New York rent control. However, some of the studies that we've got that talk about rent control look at other cities outside of New York. So we're going to take a look at all of those things. But I think what's going to be really important as we have this discussion is to look at more to look at this from the perspective of each side, right? So we talk about the tenants, talk about the landlords, and then we talk about the overall community. We're going to assess the goals that people say they have with rent control. For example, definitely what I've seen brought up is rent control helps prevent homelessness. I've seen them say it protects minority communities, prevents gentrification. Those are the 3 big ones I've heard. Kevin, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, that's a big one. Gentrification is a huge one, because what people say the goal of rent control is that if you have a neighborhood that's mostly populated by a minority or struggling population, that sometimes changes happen when the neighborhood suddenly becomes popular, rents go up, and suddenly this same housing stock that was $400 a month to rent a 1-bedroom apartment before suddenly becomes $900 a month. So that's the accusation, is that these neighborhoods become gentrified and the communities who lived in these neighborhoods are getting kicked out because of greedy landlords.
Yeah.
That's the accusation anyway.
And what's interesting to me is in this discussion, I have seen nobody mention, especially in New York State specifically, how outrageous our property taxes are and how that really can poorly impact, if your property tax exceeds your rent, then you're going to have some issues. I'll give you an example, especially in the city of Rochester. Commercial property is taxed at a significantly higher rate. I think it's like 3 times the amount of a residential unit.
You mean the rate you're talking about?
The rate, yeah, the tax rate. Yeah, so it's much larger. So say you purchase a property, the property gets reassessed on value. Ask me how I know. I'm kind of like going through the situation right now. The new taxes assessed might be significantly higher on a monthly basis than what the unit was taxed at before, and that changes the rent. It might not make sense anymore. So landlords have to assess this and see, like, can they afford to actually invest in property anymore with rent control in place. So that's a part of the conversation I want to make sure we discuss, because I don't hear it being talked about. We're going to take a brief break. When we come back, we're going to talk about specifically rent control in New York, what that looks like, and then we're going to address all these economic issues. We'll be back in a moment on Radio Free New York.
Your business relies on computers and technology to operate. Slow, unreliable networks and servers can cause unplanned downtime and affect your bottom line. The experts at Simple Tech Innovations are here to help. Their preventative maintenance program ensures that your computers and network are kept up to date and monitored for any issues, keeping your business running smoothly. They also help clients achieve HIPAA, PCI, and New York State cybersecurity compliance to keep your network safe and secure. Whatever your business IT needs are, Simple Tech Innovations should be your first call. They've won the Best in Rochester 8 years in a row and have an A+ Better Business Bureau rating. Call them today for a free consultation at 585-200-3182. That's 585-200-3182. Simple Tech Innovations.
If you're looking to market and grow your business, make new business connections, and give back to the community in a meaningful way, consider joining the Greece Regional Chamber of Commerce. We're the largest suburban chamber in Monroe County, and we offer networking, education, marketing, insurance, and advocacy. You do not need to live or work in Greece to join. Our members come from throughout the region. In short, we're better together, and together, we're moving business forward. Visit greecechamber.org or call 585-227-7272 to join today.
Tom Walls started in 1955. Since then, America has been through wars, natural disasters, and economic highs and lows. Rochester companies have had their ups and downs, but one constant, Tom Walls. Tom Walls has stood the test of time. A Wahlburger and a frosted mug of root beer on a sunny afternoon brings us closer to our past and reminds us of what is good. My name is Riley. I am Tom Walls.
Share the good times. Tom Walls.
Why do businesses choose to move their website from Wix and Squarespace to Simple Tech Innovations? Maybe it's their excellent customer service or attention to detail. Maybe it's their ability to give a truly customized solution. Or perhaps they just like the fact that Simple Tech is a local small business that builds great relationships with its clients. Whatever the reason may be, you can rest assured knowing that the local team at Simple Tech has your best interest in mind when building or updating your website. They're hands-on and love helping customers achieve their goals. But don't take my word for it. They've won the Best in Rochester
last spot
and have an A+ Better Business Bureau rating. If your website doesn't match your dreams or isn't achieving your goals, give the professionals at Simple Tech Innovations a call today for a consultation at 585-200-3182. That's 585-200-3182. Simple Tech Innovations.
You're listening to Radio Free New York.
All right, welcome back to Radio Free New York. I'm your host, Andrew Hollister. We're talking about rent control, rent stabilization. There actually is a little bit of a difference between the two. Do you want to start by explaining that, Kevin? Or?
Yeah, I mean, rent stabilization it controls how much you're able to increase rent when something's already in place, and then rent control is more specific price setting. Yeah. So, I mean, we'll kind of use the terms interchangeably a lot, but like New York State's technically rent stabilization. And we could talk about like where it applies and what type of units it makes sense and how cities may be looking to implement this.
Yeah. So to me, this is very interesting. Just in general, obviously the economic discussion, which we're going to have later in the show about this. But so I did what I always do. I go, okay, well, let me pull up the bill. Let me read the bill. The bill is 74 pages long.
Oh, it's a short one.
Yeah, but let me tell you, I mean, if you need help falling asleep, that's great, except you get like angry along the way, so it's not like good sleep. So I definitely encourage you, if this is interesting to you, go ahead, look. It's on the NewYorkSenate.gov website. It's Bill S-6458 from the 2019 legislative session. You can pull it up. You've got this very lengthy legalese 74-page document here with all sorts of a lot of green in this document. For those of you who don't know, the green is all the stuff they added, red is stuff they removed, and black is the stuff that was already there.
Christmassy.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. It is nice, though, because when you look at these bills, you can actually see the changes if something has existed. So that kind of helps draw your eye to the changes. The problem is there are like so many pages in here that there's just a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot to go through. And from what I understand, it's an amendment to the Emergency Tenant Protection Act of 1974, which is what allowed New York City, the most recent legislation that allowed New York City to implement rent control. And what the law changes is a few tenant protections, a few different qualifications for rent stabilization, and it allows upstate cities to be able to opt in under certain conditions.
Yeah. And one of those conditions, if I understood this right, correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, is, and we should definitely talk about this, is that when there's a 5% vacancy in rentable properties. So what that means is 95% or more of the available properties are rented out, which to me is interesting because I want to know. Well, first off, it's an arbitrary number, but second off, how do they know what percentage of the properties are rented out? That to me is interesting. That's going to be government survey, probably government study, all of which is going to cost our money. Yeah, exactly.
Our money.
So the first thing government's going to do to try to make things, I'm going to go out and say that this is going to make things harder on small businesses and small business owners who are renting properties. And we can talk about the exceptions later.
So, let me get to. I got this nice PowerPoint from the city of Rochester the other day. I attend those like neighborhood president meetings, so I know what happens, in the city and what they're going to do to us and how they're going to ruin our economy. So I get the heads up on that, and then I'm not able to do anything about it most of the time. But what it says is that the rental vacancy rate must be less than 5% for housing stock that would be regulated to qualify as a rent emergency. And now that's the part that caught my attention.
The regulated stock.
Yeah, so it's not the entire stock of housing. It is only qualified units. If there's less than 5%, then a city can enact rent stabilization on those units. And a qualified unit is any building that's built before 1974 with 6 or more units. So that's if it's built after 1974 or if it is less than 6 units, then it doesn't qualify for rent stabilization. So it applies a little bit less than I initially thought it did.
Yeah.
But it's still there. And in Rochester, they're estimating between 9,500 and 13,000 units. But they are doing a study for it in Rochester and in several other cities as well. So city council approved that study. So they're going to spend a bunch of money to try to figure out if the city qualifies among those units, and then they can implement rent stabilization if they qualify.
And so the interesting thing to me is living in the city of Rochester, I see all this new development for apartment complexes and high-end, apartments and stuff. And that makes me think, and I'm just going to say what I'm thinking here, that more and more people are going to switch in favor of knocking down old buildings that qualify for rent stabilization, building new ones at significantly higher rates.
You've incentivized that, right?
Yeah,
you've incentivized more building, which has an environmental cost, and you are going to build units that are more expensive because you're incentivized now to build units that no longer qualify for rent stabilization, which is a tough business model to follow.
Yeah. So I'm going to state this as, and I actually don't have a list for you guys, but I'm going to state this as reason number one. If you side with the left or Democrats in general, and you're like, we have to have rent control and rent stabilization, and that is the political ideology you align yourselves with, you're actually incentivizing more harm to the environment. and destruction of existing buildings and increased gentrification. Just off that first piece alone.
Yeah.
So that's reason number one, you know, and if you're listening to this and you've got a friend who is really pro rent stabilization, here's reason number one you can give them. They're probably believe in being environmentally friendly, and they probably want to prevent gentrification. And in step one, that actually does the exact opposite.
That's right. Now, going through what would actually happen if rent stabilization were implemented in any city in New York is there would be a rent guidelines board, and it would set permissible annual rent increases. So you'd have some board of kind of appointed people, probably some tenants, probably some landlords, and some city officials, and they would decide how much are you able to increase rent. They're going to know and understand the market well enough apparently to do that, because we know that running things by committee is the perfect way of running the economy.
It's worked in New York, right? Where we don't have a budget deficit or debt, do we? I mean, that's
so there are circumstances where you can get exemptions from the permissible annual rent increase, and that's if you increase services or equipment or make improvements to an apartment with the written consent of the tenant. If you install major-wide capital improvement, and in some cases there's some hardship approvals, but what they actually did by changing this law is they actually made that a lot more strict in what capital expenses and improvements to the property qualify for exemptions from rent increases. So that's created a huge problem in New York City, because before there was at least a little bit of incentive to make property improvements, but now those little bit of incentives to make property improvements are taken away. So you're going to see further deterioration of rent-controlled properties in the city, which will decrease the quality of housing and create more incentives to just tear these buildings down.
Yeah. No, absolutely. The other thing that I find really interesting is when you own your property, it makes sense to improve your property and maintain it over time, right? Like if you truly own your property, when you lease out property to somebody else, you're still supposed to keep in good repair, and you're incentivized to make that property better as long as you can adjust with the market and the market rate that's going on. So you may go, hey, you know what? This part of this property needs to be repaired. I'm going to have to raise rent to make this happen. And you go ahead and you do it. Your property's better. Your value's better. Your taxes now go up. So you have to raise rent to accommodate those changes, right? What this is saying is landlords can now not improve their property without written permission from the tenant, which is like very strange to me, you know.
And what's interesting is tenants can apply for like rent reduction too if they feel like there's a reduction or in services or a reduction of quality.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
You're kind of
they're applying to the board that oversees all this. They're not applying to their landlord.
Correct.
Yeah, that's as I understand it. I mean, the landlord tells the tenant like, I want to make these improvements, right. And so, but if the tenant says, I don't think I'm getting a good deal out of this, they can apply to this board, and the board can intervene on their behalf to reduce the rent.
So you guys haven't touched on this one aspect of this whole thing, which is really the beauty part of it all. You know, you got all these layers of government, and all these subjective decisions are all being made governing the use of your property. And the beautiful part is that there's absolutely no opportunity in any of this for corruption.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. It is a corrupt-free system,
guaranteed.
Wearing my clown hat while I say that one.
But sound like a clown. Andrew.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, this is going to be a major problem, and I foresee things happening like this, where the landlord says, "Hey, the kitchen's deteriorating or the bathroom's deteriorating. I need to fix this." You know, or I want to fix this. It's going to cost me $4,000 to remodel this. You're here for a year. I want to up rent, maybe $400 a month or something like that. Cover the cost. And the tenant goes, no, I don't want that. I'm not giving you permission for that. And then the tenant can turn around and go, hey, I'm paying $800 a month. my landlord hasn't fixed my bathroom or upgraded it. I think this apartment's only worth $600 a month. They go, so it's like, it could be a bad situation.
And if it's a particularly bad situation too, like the tenant would be able to withhold rent, and they would probably win in court over that. Even if the landlord doesn't have the capital to be able to invest in that without raising rents long term. But again, the landlord's just expected to eat the cost of this without being able to run a viable business.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, guys, we're going to take a break here. When we come back, I've got a couple of highlights and takeaways I want to tell you guys about this rent control. I forget what they call it. The Tenant Protection Act, I think, is the official.
Tenant Protection Act of 2019.
Yeah, there's a few things that we definitely got to talk about. We're going to talk about that when we come back on Radio Free New York.
Twice the power.
WYSL.
More powerful FM 92.1, FM 95.5 West, and 1040 AM WYSL Avon Rochester.
Here's the latest forecast from the News 10 NBC Weather Center for tonight. We'll have cloudy skies out there, just a little flurry or two. Temperatures colder in the low 20s on Wednesday. Clouds may break for a bit of sun. A chill in the air with a north wind, temps in the 20s. On Thursday, be prepared. We'll have a little snow and ice in the morning. Could be a couple of inches with some slippery travel. That'll mix with change to some rain heading into the afternoon. I'm Rich Cadelia on WYSL.
Shopping for a used car, but hate that uncomfortable feeling you get not knowing anything about its history? Well, here's how Patrick Buick GMC can help. It's simple, and it's called Upfront Used Cars. A complete history report, a recall check, all upfront on our website with full descriptions, photos, and internet sale pricing. And every price on our website matches the used car on our lot. Patrick's Used Car Supercenter puts it all up front. Every windshield has a detailed checklist showing tire tread depth, brake pad thickness. You get the picture. Check out our certified pre-owned selection and get the remainder of a 6-year, 100,000-mile limited powertrain warranty. Everything's up front at PatrickBuickGMC.com. Patrick, just off 390 exit 12, corner of Lehigh Station and West Henrietta Road. Upfront used cars, exclusively at Patrick Buick GMC in Henrietta.
Your business relies on computers and technology to operate. Slow, unreliable networks and servers can cause unplanned downtime and affect your bottom line. The experts at Simple Tech Innovations are here to help. Their preventative maintenance program ensures that your computers and network are kept up to date and monitored for any issues, keeping your business running smoothly. They also help clients achieve HIPAA, PCI, and New York State cybersecurity compliance to keep your network safe and secure. Whatever your business IT needs are, Simple Tech Innovations should be your first call. They've won the Best in Rochester 8 years in a row and have an A+ Better Business Bureau rating. Call them today for a free consultation at 585-200-3182. That's 585-200-3182. Simple Tech Innovations.
I'm Steve Tasker, and over the years, my wife and I have really gotten to know Heritage Christian Services and the work the agency does to partner with people who have developmental disabilities. We've seen firsthand how the staff provides compassionate and dignified support each and every day. And just as important, we've noticed how they welcome people of all abilities and listen to what people want for their own lives. Heritage Christian treats the people who use their services the way we all want to be treated. We all want to have a say in where we live and how we spend our days. We all want to make friends and belong. If this sounds like the kind of agency you'd like to know more about, contact Heritage Christian. They have someone who will talk you through what your needs are and how Heritage Christian can help meet them. In addition, Heritage Christian is always looking to hire the most talented people for its direct support role. Whether your family needs support or you want to work for a top-rated organization, it's worth looking into. To learn more, visit heritagechristianservices.org. That's heritagechristianservices.org.
take it. How's that? Terrific, man. Hold on. Hello.
Honey, we need help. The hot water heater's broken.
What am I going to do, brother?
Call Taylor. They do it all. Heating, cooling, and plumbing. They can install a new water heater or a tankless and get you flowing in no time. Just call 500-HELP.
500-HELP? Now that's a hot number.
I think I'm really getting it, man.
Call Taylor. 500-HELP.
Made small batches of root beer in each store since 1955. I'm Riley, and I want to cook you the juiciest cheeseburger, crispiest fries, and serve you a Tom Walls frosted mug of root beer.
Tom Walls. You're listening to Radio Free New York.
All right, welcome back to Radio Free New York. I'm your host, Andrew Hollister. We're talking about rent control. We're talking about rent stabilization. Today is our talk of the town, so this could impact you all across New York State. And
that 5% vacancy rate, that could happen in any city in New York, right? Yeah. So any city can do a study. They can determine that they qualify, and rent control could be coming to your town. So start talking to your city council members now, because, hey, who knows? Especially if you're a landlord or if you're a renter, because we're going to talk about how this impacts you negatively as a renter too.
Yeah, it does actually. And it's funny because before I saw the actual numbers on it, these are things I was thinking like, oh, wow, this is going to be bad for tenants in this way. And then sure enough, there's numbers to show that is the case. There are some things I want to make sure people know about, though. They're probably important to bring up. It makes it a lot harder for landlords to be able to collect rent, which is, in my opinion, like really silly. So if you look at any business model, forget that we're talking about landlord and tenants for a moment. Let's just talk about any business model. When you go into business, you take on risk. And you take on that risk, and it's a calculated risk to try to create profits and generate wealth for yourself. And along the way, you have to factor in government regulations, taxes, all this other stuff. And at the end of the day, you're hoping that there's more money in your pocket than what left your pocket. And it's not something that everybody's successful with. That's why a lot of people go out of business. But government creates this really unnecessary red tape constantly that hurts small businesses in New York. It hurts largish businesses too, but they can just kind of afford to get around it and lobby for things that help them and hurt their competition. So when I look at what the rent control or the rent stabilization does here, some of the stuff I could see somebody making the argument like, well, the tenant should have this. And I'll talk about what those items are. But then there's other things that increase the risk so much that I can't imagine what this is going to do to the rental market over the next year or two. So here's one thing. You can't require people to prove that they can pay rent anymore. You used to be able to ask for pay stubs. You used to be able, I think you can still do a credit check.
Yeah, so what you can do, as I understand it, is that you can set a credit score that you're looking for to be able to pay rent. So that ends up, you can say, okay, I need at least 675, right, in order to rent this property. But what that ends up happening is people who are young or people who maybe have gone through bankruptcy and they have a good steady stream of income, but their credit score is low. You have to set that cutoff somewhere. And someone who may be willing and able to pay rents, you have to cut them off if you're going to set that credit score limit at all.
And what you used to be able to do, you used to be able to ask for employment verification, which to me is much better. Somebody could say, hey, I did file bankruptcy. My credit score is atrocious, but I have a good, steady paying job. I've had it for a year. Here's a copy of my W-2 or a pay stub. You can call my employer and verify that I'm hired full time. You can't do that anymore. It's essentially illegal to do that. And so the credit score thing, I mean, that to me is I don't know. It takes away discretion from the landlord. It gives you a situation where you can no longer assess your risk before bringing a tenant in. The other thing that it does is now when a landlord's going to take a tenant to court over a past due rent, they have to actually pay to have the tenant served. You can't just deliver it yourself at least 2 weeks in advance. To me, I think people should have the advance notice, but I don't think that government has to say, like, you must pay to have this served. Like, government's now telling you have to purchase a service, which I, in general, have a problem with. Just, landlords can also no longer sue for collecting. They can only sue for the base rent. So you can't collect late fees and you can't collect legal fees anymore.
Right.
Which the way I look at that is pretty simple. Like, you're going into a lawsuit to try to collect rent, but you know how much that lawsuit's going to cost you. Like, running a small business, I've had to take clients to court.
Yeah.
Most attorneys will require a minimum of $1,000 retainer to even pick up the case. So if you want to take somebody to court, chances are you're not going to hire an attorney, and because the retainer is going to be more than what the rent is, unless it's like a luxury apartment. So you're going to go at it yourself. You may not understand the law, and it's going to put you in my opinion, a bad situation where people are going to think that not collecting rent is more worth it than being able to collect money.
Also, when it's land rental situations, isn't it the case that these tenants can get court-appointed and taxpayer-paid attorneys to defend their rights, their tenant rights?
That might be a possibility.
Yeah. Well, it depends on what it is. Like, I know Rochester has a housing court that specifically deals with these issues.
That's what I was thinking.
There are organizations that will provide lawyers. I'm not entirely. I need to do more research on whether or not it's taxpayer funded or if it's privately funded.
Well, usually it's legal aid.
But yeah, legal aid, and then so you can.
So as a landlord, you could walk into a situation where $800 is past due. You can't evict the person for it. You got to take them to court. You can't sue for your legal fees. So therefore, you're going to make the decision not to hire an attorney, but possibly the tenant might actually have a state-funded attorney or a locally funded attorney or something like that. So it to me creates a really bad imbalance in this system where everybody can't truly be equally protected anymore, because it shifts so much of the burden on the landlord, that the tenant can get the assistance, which is great. If the tenant really needs the assistance, everybody should have the ability to be properly represented. However, if you're making it so skewed that the landlord is like, I have to make the decision to not be represented because of this law, then I feel like that's starting to create like inequality the other way.
Right. And to be honest, like the stuff that we're talking about here only barely scratches the surface of a lot of stuff. Like I think we're going to need a whole other episode about that. Yeah. But like what we're kind of getting to is that like, is now much, much harder to run a business that is subject to these types of regulations, right? Yeah. So, and it's not just the 6+ units built before 1974 that a lot of these apply to. A lot of these regulations and tenant protections, and that's they apply to all landlords, right? Yeah. So a lot of these applying across the board, it creates a lot of disincentive to get into the business of managing property, and so with that being the case, what ends up happening is, you push out a lot of the small and medium-sized landlords. So it's only like the large property managers and property holders that are able to get into this business. So you end up kind of concentrating wealth and property ownership in that way too. And then you also create a lot of disincentive to improve housing and repair housing. So like that, all those buildings before 1974, it's, again, why improve those when you're going to be subject to these extra regulations? And even if you are building new housing, you're still subject to a lot of regulations. So there's a lot of disincentive to not want to build.
Yeah. So what we're getting at here is if you're thinking rent stabilization and rent control helps poor people and maybe even middle class people, you're actually starting to make the wealthy more wealthy, while the middle class and small business owners start getting out of this business model because it just doesn't make sense for them anymore. They don't have the wealth available to them to continue this model, And people in these apartments are going to be essentially, since it's disincentivizing people to repair and upgrade these properties, the properties that they live in are just going to be more and more dialect, broken down, not as good. Well, more wealthy people are going to be able to afford those luxury apartments and that sort of thing.
And what ends up happening, too, because there's these disincentives to build and repair housing, you also end up with a shortage of housing. You have fewer units getting built. You have fewer units who are able to be kept up enough to be livable.
Yep.
So if you have fewer units available, how does market economics work? You have fewer units, the prices tend to go up.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's why I thought was really interesting about that 95% filled or that 5% vacancy. They're like, whoa. When the market demands, like that happens when the market is imbalanced by regulation.
Right.
Like in no free market would 95% of anything be totally full. You know,
what's crazy to me is, okay, so we have a housing shortage, so let's make it harder to build more units and create further barriers to building units, because that's the way you fix a price surge. Is you build more stuff. It's going to force people to lower. It's going to force people to lower rents, because now you're competing with newer units at lower prices often,
But I will say this, and I've said this many times, although maybe it hasn't come up on this show. I think the fact that we have a housing shortage in Rochester is totally false. It's a load of crap. Rochester was built with 300,000 people living there. We've lost over 100,000 residents, and somehow we have a housing shortage. We don't have a housing shortage. We have a zombie property issue. But we can talk about that another show. Yeah. When we come back, we're going to talk a little more about the economics of rent stabilization and why it is a bad idea. We'll be back in a moment on Radio Free New York.
Why do businesses choose to move their website from Wix and Squarespace to SimpleTech Innovations? Maybe it's their excellent customer service or attention to detail. Maybe it's their ability to give a truly customized solution. Or perhaps they just like the fact that SimpleTech is a local small business that builds great relationships with its clients. Whatever the reason may be, you can rest assured knowing that the local team at SimpleTech has your best interest in mind when building or updating your website. They're hands-on and love helping customers achieve their goals. But don't take my word for it. They've won the best in Rochester 8 years in a row and have an A+ Better Business Bureau rating. If your website doesn't match your dreams or isn't achieving your goals, give the professionals at SimpleTech Innovations a call today for a consultation at 585-200-3182. That's 585-200-3182. SimpleTech Innovations.
Aircraft Environmental Systems proudly supports Radio Free New York. Rochester-based leaders in climate simulation chambers for America's R&D laboratories. We're experts in troubleshooting, calibrations, custom designs, and consulting for more than 40 years. Industry pioneers, we created the first ever fleet of temperature, humidity, and altitude test chambers available to rent coast to coast. Trained and trusted by environmental chamber manufacturers, we are ACES. Find us at acesinc.com.
Human trafficking is when someone is being forced, tricked, or coerced to engage in a sex trade or forced labor. If you're a kid and forced to sell sex, drugs, or work against your will, that's trafficking. You're not a criminal, and there is help available. Call the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 888-373-7888 or text Be Free. Sponsored by the Livingston County Safe Harbors Human Trafficking Task Force.
Your business relies on computers and technology to operate. Slow, unreliable networks and servers can cause unplanned downtime and affect your bottom line. The experts at SimpleTech Innovations are here to help. Their preventative maintenance program ensures that your computers and network are kept up to date and monitored.
Last spot.
Keeping your business running smoothly. They also help clients achieve HIPAA, PCI, and New York State cybersecurity compliance to keep your network safe and secure. Whatever your business IT needs are, Simple Tech Innovation should be your first call. They've won the Best in Rochester 8 years in a row and have an A+ Better Business Bureau rating. Call them today for a free consultation at 585-200-3182. That's 585-200-3182. Simple Tech Innovations.
Radio Free New York.
Hey guys, welcome back to Radio Free New York. I'm your host, Andrew Hollister. We're talking about rent control, rent stabilization, and I gotta say, maybe 2 breaks ago, I told Kevin I was really nervous because I didn't see Garrett from YouTube in the comments, and I thought we lost you, Garrett, but I see you're back. So for those of you who don't know, Garrett is like a loyal listener. He's on like every single show we do.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you everyone out there listening on YouTube, like Garrett, and everyone listening on the Facebook Live and listen to our podcast as well. Love you guys. And of course, all of our listeners on WYSL and the rebroadcast on WNY and WACK.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So thank you to all of our loyal listeners. And I'm just going out there and letting you guys know when you're not listening, I notice. That's how much we love you guys. So now let's talk some economics, right? Let's talk about kind of the meat and potatoes of this. And, Rebecca Diamond from Stanford, she did like a pretty good study on, was it San Francisco, I think?
Yes. And then was that the Cambridge one? So we're going to post it. The Freakonomics did a great episode on rent control.
Yeah.
It is very awesome. Thorough. We're going to post a link to that. We'll also post a link to that PowerPoint, and we'll post a link to the bill in the show notes and in the comments of.
Yeah, I've got it here. I'm actually going to post this link for you guys. It's called "The Effects of Rent Control Expansion on Tenants, Landlords, and Inequality: Evidence from San Francisco." Yeah. And this is a great publication. It's a lot of information. Got to hear her talk about the statistics and what they found on that podcast. And it was pretty interesting because on the surface at first, there were some things that looked like, oh, maybe this works.
It
right?
helps renters in the short term, in the very short term.
It creates maybe a short-term benefit, but a long-term failure for cities and renters in general, I think. One of the things that they brought up is they say, hey, it looks like 20% more people stay in their rent-controlled apartment when there's rent control. But what they actually found is those people just couldn't become mobile. Like they weren't actually able to move to any other place because it disproportionately shifted the rent elsewhere.
Right. And yeah, that's what it ends up doing is okay, so you have this rent controlled apartment, but the rest of the housing around you becomes more expensive because of rent control. Because there's a lot of incentive for landlords to do a couple things. One is there's a 15% decrease in housing supply in San Francisco after rent control was implemented, because a lot of owners are like, I don't know if this is worth it anymore. They converted their units to condos or owner occupants, or they just redeveloped the building sufficient to overcome the regulations. And so again, these properties that were affordable, suddenly there's a lot of incentive for them to either get sold off to an owner occupier or redeveloped into something else.
Yeah. And they found what we talked about earlier, which is less maintenance went to the property. Improvements stopped going into the property. Buildings started getting knocked down and new ones were built at much higher prices.
Yeah, because if you have rent stabilization that applies to new property, which is in some cities, that's what happens, is in like the old buildings. In some cities, it's the new properties too. Again, you want to peg your rent really high, right? Like, all right, if I can only increase it by a certain amount every year, well, I'm going to start it out pretty darn high.
Yeah. And account for those things like property tax increase and some of those other things, which is so funny because when people hear property tax, they go, well, isn't our property tax capped at 2% in New York State? It's a lie. Don't believe it. It came out of a politician's mouth. There's all these loopholes, and it does not work like
that.
And
there is a part in this podcast too about whether or not taxes can be factored in the rent increases. Like, all right, if the city's going to increase your taxes, are you able to just pass those along to the renter? I mean, because again, if you're a renter and you think you're not paying property taxes, guys, you're paying property taxes. You are. The landlord's just passing them along to you. It's not a gift.
Yeah. So what's interesting is in the commercial market, we have this thing called triple net, right? Which is you pay like a base rent and then you pay utility taxes and insurance on top of that. And sometimes like shared services. So those triple N's, like those three things can fluctuate month by month based on assessment and stuff. That's not what's in the residential market today. I see if rent control continues to be a thing and if they continue to lock down on landlords, I think we're going to see the residential market actually switch to a triple net style where you as the tenant pay a base rent, which is essentially what the landlord's going to profit off of. And then all other expenses are passed down to you in an itemized bill each month. And it's going to fluctuate. You won't actually have a solid like $850 lease anymore on your apartment. It'll be like $850 to the landlord, then a portion, your percentage of the taxes, your percentage of the insurance, your percentage of the utilities, which has been the way commercial property has been for a very long time. And I see that as the step that landlords are going to take in the future to address these issues. Whether or not that's possible with the current law, I'm not an attorney. I don't know. But I would envision that's what future rent is going to look like.
So I know we only have a few minutes left. I do want to wrap up with, hey, does the rent control actually solve the goals that we laid out? And I just want to just to hit the point home, right? Does rent control prevent prices from going up? In the short term, for those renters who are there, rent control is enacted? Yeah. In the long term, for those same renters and for anyone else who's buying into the housing market afterwards, absolutely not. And what's interesting about the study that you had mentioned is that they found that rent control actually increased gentrification and increased the displacement of low-income tenants.
Yeah.
So it's actually counterproductive to their goal.
Yeah. Well, and for all those reasons, because people had to increase the price of rent artificially now to make up for the prices they can't increase later. And if they can't do that, they just build a new building or whatever the loophole is, right? There's always going to be a loophole. They're just going to look at it and assess it as a business owner. Okay, this is what I need to do to stay in business. I will do this. In Rochester or New York State, that's going to be knocking down an old building, which displaces all those tenants, and then building a new one that they can't afford, but the others can. And somewhere else, if it's old properties instead of new, they'll just go through and do that loophole every time.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're a Democrat and you really care about decreasing the price of housing, building more affordable housing, the best thing you could do is A, don't enact rent control. It's a really, really bad idea. And B, make it easier to build new housing, build, different units. Don't put on all these conditions. The best way to decrease the price of housing in an area is to increase the supply.
Yeah. Well,
just zoning reform and no rent control. That's the key to creating affordable housing. It's doing those things.
Yeah. And this applies to everybody too, because there's Republicans that support rent control. There's independents that support rent control. It's primarily Democrats. The Republicans are pretty bad at zoning.
Love their single family zoning, even in an urban area.
But I would also say that the important thing too is for landlords to price rent appropriately, the appropriate amount of risk needs to be there. And so if you're taking away the ability for somebody to collect their money, evict a bad tenant, guaranteed, I can tell you exactly what's going to happen. Rents are just going to be set high so that only people with specifically high-paying jobs can afford them. And the risk will be lower with those people,
or enough government housing subsidies too.
Yeah, or enough government.
That's more the bad part, right? Guys. So you can do that, and then suddenly there's more need for housing subsidies because we don't have affordable housing for some reason.
Yeah,
and that's how you get situations like New York and San Francisco where the rents are absolutely outrageous, and the situation is really not that bad in like the Rochester area, the Buffalo area, like the rents really aren't all that crazy. But in New York and San Francisco and a few of these other big cities where they've enacted rent control, the prices per unit, like I have a friend who's paying like $3,000 for like a 1-bedroom apartment in New York. It's a month.
Yeah. I would say too, it's supply and demand, right? So you look at places like Monroe Ave, those in like Park Ave area, the rent is actually pretty high there, but you're paying to live in that like environment. Like you want to do that. It's hard to get an apartment there. Supply and demand. You know, you go to 19th Ward. I mean, you can get a like 4-bedroom house for $600 a month plus utilities.
If you're willing to look around, it ain't bad. I think my first apartment was in the South Wedge. It was like $700 a month, 1 bedroom. That was. For me, that was fine. I wanted to live in a cool neighborhood, so it was worth it.
Yeah. But yeah, for people to suggest, and I see this happen on Facebook too, to suggest that you can't find an affordable apartment in Rochester. Like,
no, you ain't looking hard enough. You're
just not looking where the affordable apartments are. Yeah. All right, guys, that's Radio Free New York. Tomorrow is White House Wednesday, so we'll have a presidential candidate on for interview. Catch you guys tomorrow.